Jeff asked me to record. Hopefully that's okay with everybody. I'm just going to record the screen. None of you. Although if you ask a question, you might be famous. Okay. Cool. Okay. Hi. My name is Daniel. Welcome to my seminar. It's about stock argumentation. Hello. Writing a stock case with nuance and spikes. So I have 3 goals in this seminar. Number 1 is to finish on time, which we hopefully will do. That's not a real goal. Okay, I have 3 goals. 1 is I want to explain what a stock case means to all. I want to explain what nuance means and what spikes mean. I want everyone to have an understanding of what that means. Number 2, I want to try to convince all of you of the benefits of writing stock cases with nuance and with spikes. I think there's a lot to learn from them, and I think it will help you as a debater. And number 3, I want to explain how you can actually write these kinds of cases if you're interested in doing so. Okay, part 1 is what and why. So let's start with what. Let's break down some of the key terms. So the first one is the stock case. Hopefully all of you went to James, or you all did go to James' lecture yesterday, right? So he talked about the difference between a stock case and a squirrely case. I won't spend too much time on this, but essentially a stock case is just a common case, right? It's a case that you'll hear in the literature pretty often. It's arguments that people will be discussing in newspaper articles and journals pretty commonly. It's also what most debaters will run. So stock is just a case that features common arguments. Let me ask you all for some examples. Who can give me an example of a stock pro case on this topic, the BRI topic? Yeah? Yeah, like investment good, yeah, infrastructure, trade, that kind of stuff. What about a stock con case? Coal, yeah. Like debt trap, yeah, cool. All good stuff. Okay. What about nuances? So nuances are subtle differences in a case that enhance their strategic and persuasive value. They enhance their strategic and persuasive value. So these are little changes you'll make to the case. Sometimes they won't even be observable by someone else, but they will have really important effects on how a case can be used strategically and persuasively. They'll add complexity, intrigue, and detail to the story that you're telling. And number 3 are spikes. Spikes are similar to nuance. They're hidden parts of your case, but you put them in to explicitly trick your opponent. They're kind of sneaky. And they get a little bit of a bad rep. I don't think that they should, because they're very useful. So while nuance is really about persuasion and strategy, spikes are all about making sure your opponent misses something important that you can pick up on later. Okay, so now we've gone over those basic terms. Anyone have any questions about these? Okay, cool. So I want to talk about what I see as sort of like a spectrum of casing. So James talked to you about the difference between stock and squirrely arguments yesterday. And I think that they exist on a spectrum, with the most common arguments on the left side, stock arguments, and the least common, most obscure arguments on the right side, so squirrely arguments. And then somewhere in the middle, between the most basic vanilla ice cream case styles and the weirdest flavors that you'll ever experience, like some peach pistachio or something, you got nuance and spikes in the middle. That's like the middle ground. These are like arguments that have a bit of both worlds. And I think this is where the best arguments come from, because it allows you to combine the benefits of both. I know James also talked to you about the benefits of both stock and squirrely cases. Well, I think you get most of the benefits of both when you run stock cases with nuance and spikes. Okay, let me give you some reasons why. So I think that nuanced, spiked stock cases have 5 benefits over regular stock cases and over squirrely cases. Number 1, they have a lower persuasion threshold. They have a lower persuasion threshold. What does that mean? Well, it means that your judge needs to buy your argument, right? And I think James talked about this, is that the hardest part in any round is not what your opponent will say. It's persuading your judge, right? Regardless of how tech your judge is and how they may say tech over truth, that's a bunch of BS. Because every judge in their mind has what they believe is true and what they believe is false. Some judges do a better job at getting rid of those biases, but every judge has it internally. And subconsciously, it always makes a difference. So every argument has a different persuasion threshold, which is the amount of work you need to do to convince your judge of the argument, okay? And arguments that are stock, arguments that more debaters run, arguments that you'll find in the literature, they just inherently have lower persuasion thresholds. Why? Because people have heard them more often, and they're more likely to believe them. Doesn't mean you can do less work for your arguments, but it means that you get a little more coasting room. And I like what James said yesterday. I like how he put it. He said that the hardest thing about running a squirrely case is not how your opponents will respond to it, but if your judge will buy it. That's the hardest part, right? Because with a squirrely case, you have to overcome not just what your opponents will say, but also what your judge inherently thinks about your argument. So it has that benefit. Okay. Number 2, They make your case more persuasive, more interesting, and they make for better stories. What do I mean by this? Well, I mean that I think your cases are all stories. I think every story should be grounded in something that we can all understand, concepts that we're all familiar with, but it should add a little twist. I think that all stories are best when they have a little bit of complexity, a little bit of spice and detail and nuance. And nuance through things like real-world examples, historical context, embedded frontlines, which we'll get to all of those. They weave together your argument in a more persuasive way. They make it flow better. I don't mean like you can flow it better. I mean like the words of the case flow better, and they'll make it more persuasive. Okay, number 3. They often have the best evidence. They have the best evidence. I say often, not always. I didn't say that up here because I want it to be sort of dramatic, but I say often. You can find good evidence for like most every argument, right? Well, not every argument. You can find evidence for like squirrely arguments too, but you will find the best and broadest and widest literature basis for these arguments just because more people are talking about them, right? If more people are talking about them and reporting on them and writing books and doing studies on these ideas, you're bound to find just naturally better evidence. Number 4, they beef up your cases against responses. One of the main things James said, one of the main disadvantages with a stock argument is that your opponents will have responses to it, right? Your opponents will know what the argument is in its basic form, and they'll know how to respond to it. What does that mean for you? It means that you have to beef up your case. You have to condition it and prepare it to weather the storm of responses that your opponents will read. So to have success running stock cases, you must write your case to anticipate and prepare for responses that you know your opponent will make. I'm going to say that one more time because this is really important, and almost no debaters do this. You have to write your case anticipating what they will say. Don't just write your case with your argument. Write your case with their argument and their responses to your argument in mind. I'll tell you exactly how to do that. Number 5, here's the good part though. If you can get over the barrier of number 4, if you can get over the hurdle of your opponent will know how to respond to your case, then you can get the jump on teams. Because most teams are lazy, and they don't update their block file, and they don't think about the arguments in nuanced ways. So when they see a stock argument like debt trap, or coal plants, or infrastructure, or power grids, in their mind, their brain turns off a little bit. They get a little more comfortable, and they say, I know how to respond to this. Let me open my block file. Here's the standard terms, and delinks, and disadvantages. But if your argument has nuance, if your argument has parts to it that your opponent can't predict, and that your opponent has to actually interact with and deal with, then they're going to lose a lot. And I think that something like 80% of responses that you'll hear are responses that people just read standard, right? And they have no thought put into them. So if you deepen your case and your opponent just thinks it's like some basic case, you get a huge advantage over them, right? It allows you to outmaneuver something like 80% of the responses. It makes your job frontlining a lot easier. Because a lot of your frontlines can just be you clarifying your case and explaining why they don't answer your case. And it makes you look really good. It makes them look really stupid in front of the judge, and it makes you look really good when you can get up there and say, they don't know what they're talking about. This is not our argument. Okay. Hopefully I've convinced you that there is some value. Well, you're here, so hopefully you already believe there's some value in these cases. But hopefully I've convinced you that there is some value in running a stock case. So now I'm going to talk about how you do it. Okay. Part 2. How? The recipe. So I think of case writing, I think you could think of case writing a little bit like a recipe for some food or something. We're going to add some ingredients, talk about best practices and principles, and I'm going to show you the step-by-step process of writing a strong case with nuance and spikes. Okay, the first part is principles, best practices of case writing. This applies to whether you're writing a stock case, a squirrely case, any case. I think that you need to have all these 3 things in mind whenever you're writing any case. Number 1, work industriously and consistently. There's just no way around it, right? You need to put in the time and the effort into your cases. You gotta show them a little love, right? You gotta devote some time. You can't just like throw these cases together before you get into a tournament because it really shows. It really shows to your opponents and it really shows to your judge. Cases that debaters don't invest time and energy to not only get beaten a lot more easily, but you will have less confidence running them. Let me say that again because that's important. You will have less confidence running a case that you do not put time and energy into. Why? Because you just don't care about it and you don't know as much about it. There's a reason why if you've ever given a presentation for school, you'll do a lot better on it if you've prepared for it than if you haven't, right? If you get up there and you don't know what the hell Shakespeare wrote in Hamlet, you're going to like stutter for 5 minutes and then maybe say one word and then you'll talk about Othello for another minute, right? The point is that you need to understand your case, and you need to have thought about it before the round to run it well. Just like you can taste when people don't put an effort into food very easily, a judge can taste, they can sniff out, they can suss out when you don't care about your argument. So work industriously, which means work hard and diligently, and work consistently. Work before a tournament, and work over a long period of time, right? Rome was not built in a day. Your case is not going to be written overnight before a tournament. Don't try. So don't be lazy chefs, and cook up something nice for your judge. Number 2, think deeply and think creatively. Think deeply and creatively. You can't just spend a lot of time writing your case. You can't just bang your head against the wall and expect something to come out. You've got to think really hard about what kind of case you want to produce and what kind of case will help you win the round. Okay? So it not only requires your time and effort, but it requires that you use those things well. And you use them well by thinking deeply about how your case will help you win the round. So this comes back to what I was talking about earlier. You have to think about things like how my opponents respond to my case. How will my case beat all the other cases that I might debate against, right? How can I make my case more persuasive to a judge? Think deeply about the ideas in your case, and think creatively. Spice it up. This is a big part of writing a case with nuance, right? We're not writing plain vanilla cases. You want to innovate a little bit. You want to stretch out of the norm a little bit, right? Just like the best foods are the ones that have the most thought put into them, the ones that have a little thing added to them, right? So you should be playful, and you should find new arguments. Okay. And one final thing about thinking deeply. You should be the harshest critic of your case. You should know when you can cut stuff, when you have to cut stuff, and when you have to add stuff, right? Just like for the perfect food, you can't take away any ingredients and have it be the same thing, or you can't add anything and have it be the same thing. It should be the same thing for your case. There should be nothing extraneous or extra that you could just take out. Everything that's in your case, you should have already thought about, and it needs to be there. Number 3. Discuss frequently and dialectically. Discuss frequently and dialectically. What do I mean by this? I mean, never write cases in isolation, because you're all smart and you're all geniuses by yourself, but you're much more geniuses when you talk to people around you. Every case that people write individually is going to suck. Why? Because the nature of this activity determines that your ideas get better when you debate and interact with other people. That's why we do debate, right? That's why we don't do like some writing competition or whatever. Well, even in that, right? The idea of debate is my ideas are going to improve when I interact with other people. Same thing. Before a debate tournament, you should talk to your partner. You should talk to your coach. You should talk to your teammates and your other friends in debate. Talk to your parents about your case idea. Hopefully they like debate enough to tolerate you. Because every person you talk to is going to add new insights about your case, new ways of thinking. And that's what I mean when I say dialectically. So the German philosopher Hegel talks about this idea of the Hegelian dialectic. It's this idea that with every idea, you've got a thesis, an antithesis, and a synthesis. What does this mean? The thesis is the original idea. It's the first thought, right? This is like, for me, this is my case. I go to Noah, my old partner, and I say, hey, I want to run a case about Iran. That's my thesis. The antithesis is the negation of the thesis. It's a different idea. I was like, what are you talking about? Why would we run a case about Iran, right? The synthesis is how you combine both the idea and the counter idea. So when you have a discussion with your partner or with your coach, you should not agree. If you show your case to everyone and they're like, cool, good case, then they're not thinking. They're doing something wrong. You got to find new people. Because someone should disagree with you. Someone should tell you that your idea is imperfect and needs to improve. And out of that process of back and forth, you should come out with something that hopefully is better. That's how good cases are written. So talk often, right? Talk frequently, and talk dialectically. Talk to improve your arguments. Okay. Now that you know some basic principles of case writing, let me talk about some things that you can add to your case to make it have nuance and to make it have spikes. So notice in this ingredients section, I didn't talk about the basic contention structure, right? Every contention has a uniqueness, link, internal link, impact, blah, 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 right? Hopefully all of you know that, and all of your cases already have those things. If they don't, then you should probably go to the other casing lecture about how to write a case. So I'm going to assume that all of you have those things. And I'm talking about some things you can add on top of them to make your case better. The first one are multiple warrants. This is the easiest part, and I'm sure most of you have this in your case in some form. You want multiple warrants, but maybe you don't have this, in strategic places. Multiple warrants in strategic places, right? Not all of the parts of your contention are easily hard to win. And in fact, the nature of a stock argument dictates that some parts will be pretty easy to win. Most people will accept, for example, that climate change exists and that climate change is bad. right? Most people are in debate are pretty like lefty liberal and will like give you that, right? Most people in debate will give you that like poverty is bad, right? Or that free trade is good. Well, not all people. Some people run stupid stuff. But so remember, not all parts of a contention are equally hard to prove, but some are, and you need to identify that. A part of writing a good nuanced case is knowing what parts of the case are going to be harder and easier to prove. This comes with thinking deeply, and this is where you diversify, right? Just like how you want to diversify an investment if you're investing like the stock market or other examples. Like diversification is a good thing. It's a good thing to have your eggs in multiple baskets. So when you find an argument that is hard for you to win, and I'll show you some examples after, you want to diversify into multiple places. Okay? So I don't say multiple links here because that's what most people think of. They think of, I'll just have multi-links. Well, some links are easy to prove. Some links you don't need multiple. And multiple arguments can be bad sometimes when they're extra. You want to make your job easier, but make them in multiple places. So you could have multiple parts to uniqueness, multiple parts to your link or internal link, or multiple impacts. Don't just add warrants for the hell of it. Let me give you an example. Far too many teams on this topic, some teams in this room probably, have made this argument about the BRI, that the BRI is collapsing and the EU will fund it, right? The EU will support it in some way. I'm not talking about how true this argument is or untrue. I'm talking about how you can run this argument strategically. In many teams' cases, they say that they give two warrants for why the EU will support the BRI, right? Maybe one's about funding and one's about legitimacy. It's a waste of your time. It's a waste of your time. Why? Because everyone else already agrees with you that that's going to happen. Everyone agrees with you, pretty much at this camp, that the EU has to support the BRI. So it's a waste of your time to spend a minute or spend two warrants, diversify in a place where you don't need to diversify. And if someone does respond to you, then you can just frontline it. But does that make sense? Why you only want to diversify in places where you're going to see the clash in the debate. Okay. Number 2, embed frontlines and weighing. Embed frontlines and weighing. What do I mean by this? I mean that you want to prepare for what your opponents will say, like I said earlier, right? Remember that deepening your case can allow you to outmaneuver 80% of the responses. So in your case, in the argument that you're making, you want to make little concessions, or not concessions. You want to make little acknowledgments of what the opponent's argument could be. Don't go up there and be like, now my opponents might tell you that the BRI will prevent biomass, like the BRI will create an energy grid. No. You want to weave it in seamlessly, and you want to weave it in a way that sounds like you're making your argument. It's the same idea if y'all have ever written an English paper and you're like, or some research paper, and your teacher says you need a section for a counter argument in your essay. Same thing. In your case, you should allow for sections of counter arguments. Weave in places where you already answer your opponent's arguments, because you know that they're going to make the same arguments every round, so why not just answer them in case? Same thing with weighing. You also can embed weighing and ideas of how your case comes first in your case. Okay, number 3. Give examples and historical context. Give examples and historical context. What does this mean? Well, when we debate, we talk about pretty complicated, pretty hard to understand, and pretty abstract ideas. I mean, things like, the Belt and Road Initiative is a huge project that none of us truly understand, right? Or, we talk about, like, the national debt. No one understood the national debt. I'm just like, no one did. I did not understand the national debt. So being a good debater, part of it is understanding a little more than your opponents, and part of it is being able to explain more than your opponents, right? Your opponent could know everything in the world. Your opponent could be like Ryan Jang and like be an econ major, as he's going into college. But the thing about Ryan is he understood and he could explain the arguments. That's the other part. So in your case, you want to start explaining how your arguments work by giving things like examples and giving historical context. This breaks the arguments that are abstract down into bite-sized pieces. Many of you run arguments about austerity, but none of you give arguments and examples of austerity because of BRI countries. How is any judge supposed to know how austerity looks in a BRI country if you don't give an example of it, right? Many of you run arguments about how, or some of you, about how the EU joining the BRI will hurt US-EU relations. Great. But what do EU-US relations look like now? What have they looked like in the past? What are examples of historical tension between the US and the EU? What does the US view the EU relationship as serving for them? What do they historically do when the EU makes them mad? These are questions that your case should answer. Not your rebuttal or your summary, but your case should answer. To build a coherent narrative and a story and add nuance to your case, you should be giving historical examples. All right, number 4. This is the one that all debaters do, but almost no debaters know that they do. It's called actor analysis. So most resolutions, they ask how some action changes what some actor does. What does that mean? Most resolutions propose some action. The EU should join the BRI. The US federal government should break up big tech. India should join the Security Council. We should stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia. It goes on, right? All of them almost involve an actor and an action. Resolutions change actors in 2 ways. Number 1 is capacity, and number 2 is intent. Let me give you an example. Let's not say, this is a real example. I want to buy a new iPhone. My iPhone is like iPhone 6. It's getting kind of old now. It's kind of slow. Getting some cracks on the screen. I want to buy a new one. I actually do. But I don't have any money, and my parents are not going to give me any money. So I need money. So let's make a resolution very quickly. Resolved. Give Daniel $1,000 to buy a new iPhone 10, not iPhone X, right? That's the resolution. What does that change? Well, it changes my capacity to buy an iPhone, right? If the uniqueness is I want an iPhone, but I don't have any money, and the resolution is give Daniel $1,000, then the link is with that $1,000, Daniel buys an iPhone. I don't care about the internal links and impact. Those are like eternal happiness from getting a new iPhone or whatever. But that's the important part, is that it changes my capacity to act, if that makes sense. Let's take a different resolution. Let's say the resolution was not give Daniel $1,000, but let's say the resolution is Samsung comes out with a new phone, new Galaxy, a new Note, or whatever. And let's just say, for argument's sake, it's better than the iPhone. They already are better than the iPhones, right, in terms of like tech specs and whatever. But let's say this is like really better than the iPhone, and everyone's getting it. It's the hot new thing. Does that change my capacity to get a Samsung or an iPhone? No, right? I still am down $1,000, and this one is even more expensive than the iPhones. What it does change is my intent. Now, I don't want an iPhone. Now I want a Samsung. So all resolutions, I'll give you examples of this in real life and debate. All resolutions change actors' capacity, and they change their intent. And figuring out which is which, and figuring out what your case does is imperative. And it is incumbent on you to understand that. Okay, let me give you a quick example on the topic. So let's say that the BRI increases Sino-European trade between the EU and China. Let's say that's your pro case, okay? What does that change in terms of the EU and China? Well, there's already some intent there, right? They're already each other's like number 2 and number 1 trading partners, so they already like trade, right? But what does it do if you build things like roads and ports and bridges and infrastructure and you remove trade barriers? What does that do in terms of these 2 things? Does it change the capacity or the intent? Sorry, I can't hear all of you. All right, you guys are kind of like tired or something. Can you say it a little louder? What?
Capacity.
What?
Capacity.
Capacity, exactly. Okay, someone tell me why. Someone raise their hand and tell me why. Yeah?
Removing barriers to trade allows countries to trade more, thus increasing the capacity to trade.
Cool, good. You could also argue even, you go a little further, that changing their capacity to trade also changes their intent to trade, right? If I can trade more, now I want to. That's kind of how free trade works, right? If you build a road that connects my village that was once isolated to the city, I used to not have any intent to go to the city, but now I do. Now I have an intent to get a job in the city. So, thinking about those 2 ideas, capacity and intent. They are really important for every debate and all strategy, but they're especially important in adding nuance to your case. All right. So, I've talked about some principles. I've talked about some ingredients. Now I'm talking about some process. These are some suggested steps that I have to develop a good stock case with nuance and spikes. Number 1, read deeply and listen carefully. Read deeply, listen carefully. You will find the most nuanced arguments and the best arguments when you swim past surface level readings and when you take a deep dive into the topic. All right? This means that you all should do things like read books on the topic. You should read articles that are seminal, journal articles, feature-length magazine articles, important topic reports in full. I'm not telling you to read like a 300-page book. I am telling you to read that 50-page Atlantic feature on the Saudi war or the BRI. I am telling you to read that 20-page journal, like in the journal Nature. I am telling you to read a full World Bank report that everyone keeps citing about 7.6 million people in poverty. Why? Because if you read those things in full, you will understand the context behind them and the stories that those are telling. Everyone has read the 7.6 million people out of poverty, but almost no one understands how they got to that number, why that number matters in that study's context, or those kinds of things. Read the important articles in full and read deeply. That is how you get the most nuanced arguments. That is how I got almost all of my most nuanced arguments and best arguments is from reading. Okay, you just kind of cannot substitute this step. There really is no substitute for reading well and reading deeply. You also should listen. Listen carefully to the arguments that your opponents make and that other debaters make. Keep an ear to the meta, so to speak. Keep an ear to what people are saying on the topic, right? So sometimes in the cases and cards and blocks of your opponents even, you'll find great inspiration. So don't shy away from that. Number 2, once you've read and listened, once you have a sense of the arguments on the topic, you should list all of the arguments that are important. Make a list with your partner, with your team. Whether this is your first tournament on the topic or your fourth, you should have a running list, and a pretty big list, of all the arguments on the topic. Make sure you update it as the topic goes on. Okay. Number 3, from that list, you should pick the most strategic argument. I said strategic, right? Cool. Okay. Strategic argument. This most likely means that the impact of the argument outweighs or links into all of the other impacts on the topic. I can't overstate the importance of this step. Make sure that the argument you pick has an impact that outweighs or links into all other impacts on the other side. That's why you need the list, so you can look at all the other arguments. There is simply no point in writing a case where your impact does not beat their impact. And I know James talked about this yesterday. But if you do, you kind of played yourself, because it means that you start the debate from the behind, and you can't win the debate if it comes down to weighing. But if I wanted to say best impact, then why don't I just say best impact? I said most strategic. 2 reasons. Number 1, you should pick these arguments because they have good impacts. Pick them within reason, right? Obviously, don't just pick an argument because it has a big impact, right? Because then we would all be running one impact, nuclear war. And this is not policy debate. Not all scenarios end in nuclear war or extinction. I'm sorry if you thought this was policy debate, but it's not. This is the stock casing seminar. And the thing about stock cases is that they can have good impacts, but they must have reasonable link chains. They must have reasonable ways for you to get there. You're free to run whatever argument you want, but you must acknowledge that bigger impact arguments generally are less probable, and they're less likely. It is much more likely that I stub my toe as I leave Anson and I walk back to Colonial or Walker than for a nuclear war to happen, right? Than for Donald Trump to push the nuclear button. Well, scarily, it's not that much more likely, right? But you get the picture, is that big impacts, big stake impacts, are always less likely. Just because like the fundamental physical laws of inertia, and that it takes more energy to do bigger things. So pick your arguments within reason. Have an argument with the best strategy, but have an argument with the best strategy that you also can win. There's no point in having a good impact if you can't win the link chain. Number 2, I didn't say strategy, I didn't say impact, because not all topics have impacts. Well, not all topics concentrate on the impacts. Some topics concentrate on the internal links into the impacts. Good example, the Saudi topic. Everyone impacted to Yemen on the Saudi topic because that was the biggest impact. Or the missile defense topic from a while ago. Everyone impacted then into a nuclear war because that was agreed upon that was the scenario if we did or did not a missile defense. In those cases, the impact you have doesn't matter. The internal link, who is a stronger way of getting into that impact, does matter. Or same thing if you're debating climate on this argument. Okay. Number 4, we already talked about this. Diversify warrants in strategic places, right? Once you got like a fire impact, once you got like a baller strategy and impact, then you got to look into the links and warrants and make sure those already stand. Do some more research. Try to find the holes or maybe better parts of the argument. If you find that your argument has bad warrants, bad links, no, don't be afraid to scrap it and go back. Number 5, pepper in, little food pun, examples and historical context. Pepper in examples and historical context. Remember, these deepen your argument and they make them a lot more digestible, another food pun, to your judge. They make them more digestible to your judge. Your job as a debater is to break down big ideas into bite-sized arguments. Number 6, bake in embedded frontlines and embedded weighing. Bake in embedded frontlines and embedded weighing. I say bake in because some debaters throw them in their case and they say outwardly like, now let's respond to what our opponents say. Don't say that. Make this like a story and make it flow. All right, let me make 3 important qualifications to that. Number 1, this is an organic process. Just like no one wants to eat a bunch of processed food, no one wants a step-by-step thing. You should not follow this step-by-step. I can't tell you what the process of writing a case should look like, and you should experiment with it and find what works best for you. Don't just follow one process, okay? Number 2, don't forget the strategy. Whatever argument you do, whatever way you do it, whatever order you do, the most important out of any of these is number 3. Pick the most strategic argument. You have to have an argument with the best impact that outweighs all other impacts, or an argument with the best strategy that links you best into that impact. Number 3, you will repeat these steps, and you should. Remember, case writing is dialectical, and it is incremental. You have to build on it bit by bit, piece by piece. You have to be okay with it getting shut down, with your brilliant idea getting shut down by your partner or your coach or even your parents. That's good, because throwing out worse arguments gives you more room for better arguments in the future. Okay, so hopefully I haven't bored you too much with me talking about how to write a case. We got about half an hour now, and I think this is a good time to show you some examples. So if everyone hasn't already, please get out a piece of flow paper and a pen. We're going to flow a little bit. Okay, everybody good? So the way this is going to work, I've got a couple of the cases that I've written up here. We're going to read through them. I want you all to flow them. And then we're going to talk about them, talk about some strategic elements, maybe even some unstrategic elements, and have a discussion about them after. Okay. So everybody ready? All right, sorry, 1 second. Okay. All right. We affirm, resolve, the U.S. should end its arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Our sole contention is that ending arms sales is essential to ending the war in Yemen. For the past 4 years, Saudi Arabia has been waging a brutal campaign in Yemen that has gone nowhere and resulted in countless civilian deaths. The U.S. has given Saudi Arabia a blank check, enabling it to continue killings without any constraints. Mohammed Bazi at The Atlantic writes in 2018, quote, Saudi leaders want a clear-cut victory in their regional rivalry with Iran, and they've been emboldened by the Trump administration's unconditional support to stall negotiations. Saudi Arabia and its allies are more likely to accept a peace process if it is clear that the U.S. will not provide the military assistance required to keep the war apparatus going. Ending arms sales is the only way for us to use our leverage and force Saudi Arabia to end the war. Nicholas Kristof writes in the New York Times in 2018, the best leverage America has to make the Saudis part of the solution is to suspend arms sales so long as Riyadh and the Saudis continue the war. This is for 2 reasons. First, crippling the military. Saudi Arabia is almost entirely dependent on U.S. arms, a trend that has accelerated in recent years. Angela Dewan reports in CNN in 2018. A number of countries have restricted arms sales to Saudi Arabia since the kingdom began airstrikes on Yemen in 2015, like Germany and the UK. Despite these decreases, the U.S. almost doubled its exports. The U.S. accounted for 61% of major arms sales to the Saudis. The UK was a distant second with a 23% share. China supplies a negligible amount of major weaponry to Saudi Arabia, and Russia supplies so little that it is not included in the database. Ending arms sales will cripple the Saudi military and force them to end their campaign in Yemen. Bruce Rydell of the Brookings Institution explains in 2018, the Saudi Air Force must get spare parts, technical upgrades, maintenance, expertise, you name it, every single day from the U.S. in order to operate. If that flow of spare parts came to a close tonight, The Royal Saudi Air Force will be grounded tomorrow morning. Second, sending a signal. Beyond the physical sales of arms, Saudi Arabia relies on the U.S. alliance to protect themselves from outside threats. Missy Ryan writes in a 2018 Washington Post article, for Saudi Arabia, the race to arm itself has been aimed not just at boosting its fighting power, but also deepening political ties with producer nations like the U.S. The favor those sales have carried is starkly visible in Trump's White House. The Saudis rely on the U.S. alliance to protect them from Iran. Nicholas Kristof writes in the New York Times in 2018, the Saudis buy our weapons because they come with an implicit guarantee that we will bail the Saudis out militarily if they get in trouble with Iran. Saudi Arabia's armed forces can't even defeat a militia in Yemen, so how could they send it to Iran? That's why we have leverage over Saudi Arabia. We know the Saudis respond very strongly to U.S. pressure. As Nicholas Niarchos explains in a 2018 New Yorker article, it is no coincidence that the humanitarian crisis in Yemen fell off a cliff when Trump entered office and made Yemen not a priority. We also know that the increasing international pressure on Saudi Arabia following the Khashoggi murder has had some positive effects, but the U.S. must step in for the Saudis to fully change. Doug Bandow at the Cato Institute writes in 2018, the ongoing peace talks offer some hope. They have advanced further than previous attempts. The fact that Western nations have turned against the war encouraged Saudi Arabia to start making concessions necessary to reach a more enduring peace. However, so long as we count on a blank check from Washington, the kingdom has no reason to temper its policy. Okay. So now I want to go through the case a little bit, and I want to go through some strategic elements. So on the left side, I put up the things that we talked about, the ingredients, then add nuance and spikes. So I want someone to give me an example of each of these things in the case. So number one is multiple warrants. Where can we find an example of that? It should be a pretty easy one.
This is for 2 reasons.
Yeah, and what are the 2 reasons?
Crippling the military and sending a Saudi Arabian or sending a signal.
Cool. Let's go a little further. Why would it be strategic to make those 2 warrants there?
Because you need one of those with the argument.
Yeah, yes. We have to win one of those to win the argument. Yeah, and on this topic, right, the Saudi topic, that was the big debate. How would ending arms sales change the Saudis? Would it make them end the war, or would it make them not end the war? So that's why we diversified here. And I'll talk a little bit, we'll get back to these 2 links, because they'll become important later. Okay, let's talk about embedded front lines and weighing. Yeah?
When you said like China supplies a negligible amount of major weaponry, and Russia supplies so little, not including the database, so there's no China and Russian database.
Perfect, yeah. And so can you explain that argument a little more?
Like if the US ends arms sales to Saudi Arabia, and we'll just switch to China or Russia for the arms, and we can't do that.
Good, yeah, that was one example. Okay, how about, yeah?
Also, like when you give the example of the killing and explain like that Saudi Arabia like responded positively to that, to like historical example.
Okay, yeah. So you beat me to this one. Good. So that's examples of historical context.
Oh,
You good? Yeah. All right. Let's do the final one. Actor analysis. Is there any actor analysis in this case? Yeah. Nathaniel?
Links are like the first one is capacity, the second one is intent.
You got it. Boom. And explain that a little further.
Like the first one talks about how Saudi Arabia just like loses the ability to do things in Yemen, and that also kind of talks about intent, like they're more likely to go to, well, like it's talking about the first part about they're more likely to go to a peace talk, but the second one is really talking about signaling to Saudi Arabia that they have no further intent to fight the war because they can't defend themselves anymore.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay. Yeah, that was great. Okay. So again, the first one deals with the Saudis can't fly planes. Pretty clearly, that's capacity, right? The second one deals with intent. They don't want to fly planes anymore. Even if they had the planes in the first place, they wouldn't want to use them because they need the U.S. to back them up, and the U.S. won't back them up so long as they fight in Yemen. I did a version where I annotated the case. I don't think this is very useful because you guys already got everything. I'll talk about it a little bit. Okay, so I highlighted this. They want a clear-cut victory in the regional rivalry with Iran because this sets up the idea later in the second warrant of intent, right? That the reason why the Saudis are in Yemen is not because they hate the Houthis, although they don't like the Houthis, right? The real reason is because it's a proxy war. They're fighting their regional rival, Iran. They see it as an existential fight, kind of like us in Vietnam in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. That if they lose this war, it's actually much worse. Imagine if Vietnam was to our south or to our north, right? They have an enemy state on their border. So the Saudis cannot tolerate Iran. That's why they need and that's what the Kristof quote says, right? They can't even defeat a militia in Yemen, so how could they stand up to Iran? That's why they need the U.S. Okay, we talked about crippling the military. We talked about the embedded front line against Russia. We talked about capacity. Cool. Anything else? And then we talked about the example of it got worse when Trump came in, and it got better after the Khashoggi murder when Western nations in Europe started pressuring them. One more thing is that this serves right here. This serves as both active analysis and weighing. Because this topic, remember, there was just one impact. It was the Yemeni war. So it was just which team solves better for that impact. And I consider this an embedded frontline and embedded weighing. Because what we would almost always do in every round on this case is we would concede this argument. Or we wouldn't go for it, right? Because like what's her name? Yeah. Like what Vivek said, right? They're going to say China and Russia will give them the arms, right? We would end up conceding that, or we wouldn't collapse on it. We would almost always collapse on this one, because I think it's a much more powerful idea. Because even if the Saudis have the weapons from Russia and China, will Russia and China come to their aid if Iran invades them? No, right? Russia, Putin, is an ally of Iran. That's why Russia's in Syria. And China wants no military involvement in the Middle East. So they don't get a security guarantee from Russia or Iran. They get the tanks and the planes, but no guarantee. And this is a form of weighing. It's a form of comparative analysis. It's a form of you comparing the strength of their link into the impact versus the strength of my link into the impact. I say my link matters more because I know what the actor thinks like. Even if you're right that one part is true, that they have the capacity to act, if they don't want to act, they won't do it. Okay. I've got a couple other examples, but before I go into that, I'm kind of more interested in seeing what all of you have. So that's why I asked y'all to open your cases. So if y'all could open your cases, and I want to go over some examples maybe of stuff in your cases. So someone from their case, give me an example of multiple warrants. And this one is like the easy one. Multiple warrants. Someone give me an example of multiple warrants in their case. Well, I guess it's okay. You're here to learn how to write multiple warrants. But no one has multiple warrants in their case? Yeah?
You want me to like read them?
You just name them. Yeah.
We just explicitly say there are two specific warrants for the BRI would save the shipping industry. And we list out.
Perfect. Yeah, right? You're diversifying. And why'd you put those there?
Because it's probably, I mean, in terms of like weighing the impact, it's difficult if we're only going to constrict ourselves to one half.
Yeah, good, right? You got this big behemoth. You got to prove the BRI helps shipping. Give several reasons. Okay, how about embedded front lines and weighing? Who's got one of those in their case?
Running a war scenario, so front lines are usually just assured destruction.
What do you say?
Mearsheimer 14 says the situation in Asia is really different from the Cold War. There are lots of little conflicts that sides don't think will escalate to nuclear war, so they don't even consider using nukes. And that's where the conflict starts.
Good. Yeah. Perfect example, right? This may be the ultimate standard response is mutually assured destruction to almost any nuke war scenario, right? But this nuance of the conflicts in Asia operate differently than the Cold War, and these countries may not respond to mutually assured destruction, that's perfect. Okay. How about examples or historical context? Who's got an example? Yeah, Claudia?
Well, we're running like a China-India war scenario, which sounds like a little weird, but so we have this like historical context about how there was a war in like 1962, that's something super similar to what we're running.
Good, perfect, right? And that's a perfect example. The historical context should frame your argument and should add to the understanding of your argument. And if the historical context says, this is what's happened in the past for the same conditions, it can be repeated again. Cool. How about actor analysis? All of you have it. It's just a matter of recognizing it. Huh?
I mean, this is kind of, but we talk about in like the overcapacity scenario, how like Chinese industrial firms, even though they have like the capacity to continue building out steel, like it only causes more overcapacity in the first place. So even though their intent is to get rid of overcapacity, the ultimate like outcome is just making it worse.
So what changes with the resolution?
Yeah, so like I feel like it's separate, but they would be able to offload capacity.
So that's capacity, right?
Yeah.
Right. The intent, meaning why these firms overproduce, probably won't go away, right? It's a bug, it's a feature of a state-controlled system where they don't respond to the market telling them you're making too much. They don't respond to supply and demand. But it gives them the capacity to offload their excess supply because they can give it to other countries. Good. Most all of you have links that deal with capacity because those are the more basic kind of links, which is like, how does this change the capacity? How does this change the ability? You can offload, right? You can build coal plants. So think about that. Make sure you are thinking about that. All right. What time is it? Okay. I think we have time for one more example, and I'd also like to get some questions. But I want to give you all one more example. Okay. So this was from last NATS, 2 NATS ago. It was the U.S. or the benefits of NAFTA outweigh the harms. North American Free Trade Agreement. And this was our con case. NAFTA bad. All right, ready? We negate that the benefits of NAFTA outweigh the consequences. Our sole point of contention is that NAFTA fuels the Mexican drug war. NAFTA has strengthened Mexican cartels in 2 ways. Number 1, cartels exploit the inequalities created by NAFTA. NAFTA's effects have been highly unequal. Jose Gonzalez at the CFR writes in 2017, NAFTA drove the growth of foreign investment, high-tech manufacturing, and rising wages in Mexico's industrial north. However, the largely agrarian south, farming south, has lost out. 2 million small-scale Mexican farmers were put out of work by cheap corn that flooded in from the U.S. because of the lowered trade barriers. Even among farmers who kept their jobs, they now earn 1/3 of what they did before NAFTA. Cameron McKibben at the Council on Hemispheric Affairs writes in 2018, this inequality between the affluent North and impoverished South has contributed to the success of drug trafficking organizations. Without any opportunity to earn a satisfactory income through farming, NAFTA created a network of disenfranchised individuals for the drug traffickers willing to pursue profit in the illicit economy. Some farmers left the South for better opportunities for manufacturing jobs in the North, but even they became susceptible to cartel recruitment. Caitlin Thisiem of the LA Times explains in 2017. Many Mexicans went to frontier towns like Juarez. Migration to cities like Juarez marked a cultural shift where parents worked all day, and without extended family to look after them, children often found themselves alone. Drug cartels, whose power was growing, found easy recruits. As the city erupted into gang warfare, murders spiked, along with suicides and violence against women. The cartel's control over disenfranchised areas has become quite substantial. Christy Thornton of The Nation reports that as of 2008, the drug trade has become Mexico's 5th largest employer. Second, cartels exploit the supply routes created by NAFTA. McKibben reports that whether by train, truck, or foot, the traffic crossing the border increased exponentially since NAFTA. By increasing cross-border trade, NAFTA inadvertently reduced transaction costs and potential risks for drug trafficking organizations. As a result, NAFTA dramatically increased the flow of drugs entering the U.S., raising the amount by 25%. There are 2 impacts of strengthening the drug cartels. Number 1 is killings. Michael Lauderdale at UT Austin explains in 2012 that the cartel business strategy has been to control a turf. Cities have become turf wars fought over by cartels. Committing murders and hanging bodies from bridges are common cartel tactics used to centralize power in their area, and civilians are often caught in the crossfire. As cartel power has increased under NAFTA, so have deaths. Lenthium reports that there were 20,000 drug homicides in Mexico last year, and it is clear that drug deaths have been increasing since the 90s. Overall, Lenthium finds that 175,000 people have been killed. And the murders have been so bad that, according to a 2017 Vox article by German Lopez, Mexico's life expectancy has stagnated, and in Meg's case has dropped after 6 decades of increases. Second, stunting economic growth. In a 2016 Business Insider article, Chris Way explains that high levels of violence in Mexico have prevented complex economic activities from starting and growing. These are sectors that require a lot of skills, like technology, professionals, software, and development, like the aerospace or automobile industries. Additionally, Mexicans are leaving the country for higher education because of the violence, a trend that is depriving the country of workers with the skills needed for advanced industries. For every 10% increase in homicide rates in Mexico, you see an increase in unemployment of 0.5%. The disruption of these industries has had impacts on the entire Mexican economy. Vidrano Rios at Harvard finds in 2008. Mexico has lost 12% of its total GDP because of drug violence. Oh, sorry, I forgot to. Okay. Cool. So let's talk about some things there. So where do we see multiple warrants? Where do we see multiple warrants in the case? Uh-huh.
Within the inequalities, you have people in the South are now forced to do drugs that even, or even cartels that even they move to the North, their children are now being reported to.
Good. That's actually an example of something else. What is that an example of these? Kind of. Let's focus on the even if, right? You said, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. You kind of skip what I was getting to, but this is a good one. I thought this case was kind of fun because it's kind of like a lose lose. It's not fun. I hate debate. Okay. Because the way that NAFTA meant that we lowered tariffs on corn. So like the U.S. makes corn a lot cheaper because they have better machines and whatnot. So they sold it much cheaper in Mexico, and lots of Mexican farmers lost their jobs, right? And if I lose my job as a farmer and I'm in a rural village and I have no opportunity, I can only turn to a cartel and I start making opium or marijuana on my farm. But some people left, right? They migrated to the north, to Juarez, to Mexico City, to Mexicali, to Hidalgo, and they went for industrial jobs in manufacturing. This was a common response, right? They said, well, in the long term, NAFTA solves because people will move, they'll go to cities, there's opportunity, they'll get richer, and I don't have to work for a cartel if I have a higher income. Well, but maybe you don't work for a cartel, but your kid does, because you're working 10 hours, 12 hours a day at a factory. Your abuela, bisabuela, your tío, tía, they're not on the farm with you anymore. They're back at the farm. So your kids are unoccupied. So either way, they join the cartels. Okay, that's a good example of multiple or of embedded frontlines. How about multiple warrants? This is like a super easy one. Someone who hasn't spoken yet.
Like at the top, you say it's threatens cartels and communities, and then exploiting inequality and exploiting environments.
And then the other one? The other example of multiple warrants. Oh, it's right here. Whoops. We said there's two impacts. These are warrants, right? Impacts are also warrants. They're warrants for why it's bad, right? Okay, very simply. How about examples and historical context? Anyone examples or historical context? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You sort of flesh it out a little bit. You talk about one city, Juarez, and what happened there, and the increase in murders and whatnot. Okay, any actor analysis? You're almost done with me. Just give me this one more thing. Any actor analysis? Someone who hasn't spoken. I really hope that just 5 people are not the only ones who have learned anything in this seminar. Mm-hmm.
People lose their jobs, so they have an incentive to go towards drug cartels.
Good. Yeah, that's incentive. And there's also capacity. Where's the capacity?
It's the only way for them to make money, I guess.
That doesn't make it easier to sell drugs, though, right?
Oh, it's the cross-border trade.
Yeah. Good. Cool. So it has both. All right. I pretty much said that. Everyone said that. Yeah. So we got embedded front lines. This is an incentive to work, right? Without satisfactory income, there's disenfranchised individuals, and they want to pursue profit. Embedded front line. The example, good. Anything else? That's pretty much it. Oh, this is the other one thing, right? So obviously cartels are bad because they kill people, but they're also bad because they hurt economic growth. And this takes out the big response to cartels, which is that in the long term, you grow the economy through NAFTA, Mexico gets richer, and then the cartels go away. Well, if the cartels prevent economic growth, they prevent complex economic activity, you can't grow. So it short circuits the impact. Okay, we have a little time for questions. Any questions, concerns, comments, hate mail? Some of you seems like you really hated my lecture. All right, let me give you some prompts. Maybe, what are some common issues you face when writing cases? Yeah? Lottie?
Well, sometimes like you have a really good idea, but like link chains can be kind of thin, and there's not like articles that explicitly like tab multiple pieces of your argument. So you have to like find like a ton of articles, and your link chain gets kind of sketchy. Like how do you write a stock argument without like using a ton of different like articles?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I'd appreciate if people held up on packing before you left. This is important insight. If you don't care about the lecture, you're free to leave, but I imagine all of you have issues with writing cases. So, okay. Yeah, that's a good question. Well, hopefully with stock arguments, the link chains aren't too hard, right, because they're stock, which means that they have fairly solid links. In terms of how do you find those arguments, and that's why you generally want to stick to a stock argument, right, because the link chains will be there. So if you have an argument about, like coal plants on the con, right, that link will hopefully be there. I would say don't be afraid of longer link chains. It's okay if your link chain takes a little more time to establish, but the evidence should be there. You should find topical quality evidence, and you should be able to defend it in a pretty succinct way. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah?
This is something that James also kind of talked about. So, like, how did you approach a topic in terms of, like, the prep part, I guess? Because he would be like, I would think of the arguments first and then maybe prep an argument, or did you look at, like, the general?
Yeah, that's also a good question. So I think it's a bit of both. I think you gotta do a lot of time thinking and talking, right? James talked about like his brainstorm sessions with Milburn. That's good. You should brainstorm with your team or partners. That's a good way for you to think of arguments. And just like think of them as you're going around your day. And then also reading and prepping is an important part. Like you can just find good arguments by prepping, either prepping generally or prepping one argument. You can find a different argument. So I think it's a bit of both in how you find cases. And you need both. You need prep to give you depth, and you need the thinking part to allow you to process all that you're reading. Yeah. Any other thoughts or issues?
I guess when you talked about finding a strategic argument impact, the way you phrased it, I got the impression that you like used to do the impact, like, the way you did, like you used an impact that could way easier, and then you thought about words, or like how did you like go about finding a strategic impact, strategic argument in the first place?
Yeah. So I mean, that's how I did it. Like, because you have to start with the impact, because if you don't start with the impact, you might get an impact that doesn't outweigh all the other things. Like for example, this drug cartel argument, we wrote it like at the tournament because our neg case sucked and had like a terrible impact. And at first the link story wasn't great. People really only read this argument about how it increases the flow of drugs, not the incentive part. But we knew that the impact short-circuited all the AF arguments. So you want to start with the impact. You want to think of the links while you're thinking of the impact, right? Obviously, like I said, don't just jump to nuclear war, don't just jump to climate change or any extreme scenario because it beats all the other impacts. But think of, in the basket of stock arguments I have, in the basket of arguments with reasonable link chains, which one is the best? And that's why the list of arguments is so important. Yeah. Cool. Anything I missed in this lecture that you want me to talk about? I'm giving this again next week as well, so I'd appreciate feedback. Anything other advice on cases? Any disadvantages of this style of cases? There are certainly disadvantages. There are reasons to run squirrely cases or more basic stock cases. No? I've converted all of you? You're all going to run stock nuance cases? Yeah, Avalon?
Would you guys usually do like a sole contention to keep a narrative, or ever run like two contentions? Or I guess, yeah.
We would always run one contention because I think it gives you more time for nuance, right? It gives you more time for more warrants, because these things take up space and time, right? Historical context and frontlines and multiple warrants, they take up, and actor analysis, they take up space and time, right? So if you have two contentions, you'll have less time for each. I was going to show you another example here. Actually, we did run two contention cases sometimes. You would just have them like more condensed. So you can run two contentions, but you want to run them with the idea of like collapsing on, like how you would collapse on one or the other. You want to run them with the idea of the strategy. And yeah, I think that one contention cases are generally better for having nuance because it gives you more time. Yeah. Okay, cool. One more thing before I let you all go. I have to take roll call very quickly, so none of you were like missing or kidnapped. Because some of you came in very late. All right. So very quickly, from Summit, Nibhan Abkar. All right, Yukiho's here. Nathaniel's here. Rishi. Okay. Ali or Ali Lee. Son. Cool. Daniel Yang. Stefan Boone. Michelle Zhao. Jason Hu. Randy Wang. And Sophia Jansen. Okay, cool. All right, thank you all.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.